Welcome back to another episode of Matrickz Tech Talk. Today, I'm super excited to have John Matrickz from all the way across the Atlantic, who is the head of autonomous vehicle safety at Lyft. John, welcome to Matrickz Tech Talk.
Good morning. Thank you.
Yeah, John has been working in the automotive industry since 30 years. He has experience in several verticals in the automotive industry. He was part of the U.S. Department of Transportation, and now he's responsible for AV safety at Lyft. So, John, I'm super excited. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and your passion?
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. I'm definitely excited to talk to you today. I always love to get into detail on safety, particularly automated vehicle safety. As you mentioned, I've got roughly about 30 years of experience in the automotive industry, primarily focused on safety. I had the great experience of working for two large OEMs, both Ford and Volkswagen, and on many different programs, certainly even way back to the early days of airbags. And I think that's got some interesting ties to where we are today. But also had the opportunity to lead NHTSA's AV safety program, originally created as the head of research for vehicle safety at NHTSA. Also opportunity to work in academia at the University of Michigan and Texas A&M University. So it's quite interesting to think about how far we've come on automotive safety in the last 30 years, really the last 50 years, but even more interesting is the opportunities for the next 10 or 20 years with automation. And so definitely happy to discuss and brainstorm with you today. Looking forward to the conversation.
Amazing. So you have already mentioned, the journey that we have taken in the last 50 years, all the way that we have crossed, and even more exciting what's going to happen in 10, 20 years in terms of safety when it comes to automated vehicle. I'm going to start a little bit from the past. So you worked 30 years in this industry, and the pace at which the industry was moving in the last 30 years compared to any other industry, be it digital transformation, in the traditional IT industry, internet, social media, it was slow. And now in the last decade, we have seen a little bit of a catalytic effect in this industry when it comes to AV. So AV is moving the industry faster, the idea of AV. In my opinion, three technologies is going to change the industry once and for all. Definitely AV, connected vehicles, and electrification of vehicles. So all these things, putting in the safety perspective in your entire experience, why do you think we've been so slow? And why do you think these things are really catalyzing things to move forward faster?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think over the first, let's say, 20 years of automotive safety, things did move somewhat slow. And I would use the word measured. We are talking about products that really protect us. We physically move our bodies from point A to point B at great speeds, and certainly with the possibility of when there is a collision or a crash or other bad event that there could be actual physical harm and death involved. So it is critical that we get safety right for automotive. And that's true of any transportation mode or any critical industry, but certainly for transportation. We think about we think about the way that we live. Transportation is critical. It's one of the basic human needs. We have to get to places to get food or to interact with people or to go to the hospital or to go to school. And so it has taken time, but frankly, that time was important to get it right. And so for the first, let's say, 30 years of automotive safety, focused on crash worthiness, what happens in a bad event, what we call a crash. We were innovating then, and that took time. Now, I will say that you're absolutely right. Things have accelerated with the opportunity of, I'll use crash avoidance broadly, but certainly with ADAS and automation. And so it is interesting because now, while we made great strides on automotive safety in the first 30 years, it did take time, and we started to reach an asymptote of effectiveness or the rate of change of safety improvement. And that's because you can only do so much to prevent someone when there is a bad event like a crash. Now we've got a new opportunity to avoid a crash or avoid a bad event altogether. And so we are reaching a point, entering this next phase of automotive safety, where we can actually, prevent the crash completely, and it's getting quite a lot of attention. Secondly, of course, with automation particularly, there's a great societal benefit in addition to safety. Safety is the primary benefit, but certainly efficiency and freeing up of our time in the transportation mode. So there's a great, I'll say, technological draw. People like the idea of not having to drive all the time. Some people still want to drive some of the time, and I think that's probably right, including myself. But I certainly like the idea of being able to rely on the technology to get me to point A to point B. And so I think this acceleration partly is due to the fact that the technological draw for people who are using this to get from point A to point B is quite interesting. And that's driving companies, and that's driving even governments and other stakeholders really to get involved in this new technology. So I will say that we still need to get it right. We still are transporting humans. We still have a strong need to make sure that the technology is ready to be deployed. But I think that draw is what's accelerating right now.
Fascinating. You mentioned several stimulating points here, and I'm gonna build on those. Now, it's not only safety, as you mentioned, although one of the motivating factors for ADAS was safety. So it's fascinating that AV is going to make our lives safer if we do it right. Other changes that you mentioned in society, life is going to change completely. It is not going to be only the mode of transportation that's going to be changing. We're going to change in a way we socialize, we interact with people, the way we work with people. Everything's going to, the way we dwell, the real estate price can have an effect with AV. It's going to be one of the biggest changes of our time, for sure. Now, one thing about the automotive industry, traditionally, we're making money based on the idea of ownership. We own a vehicle. Like, you work for two traditional OEMs. They make money because everybody wants to own a vehicle. Now, there is a good chance this idea of ownership will be obsolete. People will use it as an app rather than a car for me to move from point A to point B, be it a AV or a drone taking me from point A to point B. So it's a mechanism to go there. So how do you think the traditional automotive industry is going to cope with that, and how far are we from that era where your car is merely your app?
There is a significant change already underway and likely to accelerate there. In fact, that's one of the prime reasons that I came to Lyft. Because I really do believe that the future of transportation is going to certainly we're going to see a large increase in the number of people who use transportation as a service through an app like Lyft. Will we ever get away fully from an ownership model? That I don't know. I guess it depends on where you live and how often you need to access a vehicle. Certainly in cities, and I can tell you firsthand experience. I have had recently 13 vehicles. Now I'm down to 7 vehicles myself, and I can tell you that the cost of ownership of a vehicle is more than just the original purchase price, of course. And so when you live in a place like New York or San Francisco or Munich or where it's expensive to keep a car, people will start to realize that they don't necessarily need to purchase a vehicle. However, having said that, it is about that physical, basic human need of physical transportation, getting yourself or your family from point A to point B, or goods from point A to point B. And so there is still a need for a vehicle. And the automotive industry is very well finely tuned. I mean, if you think about the ability of that industry to produce vehicles that are highly capable and frankly quite safe at some sort of affordable price, the automotive industry, it really does hit that target quite well. So I guess what I'm saying is I see a future of combined where people maybe need to own multiple vehicles, or if you live in a dense city, you may not need a vehicle at all, but certainly others that might live in a more spread out suburban or rural area may want a vehicle. But bottom line is we still need that physical vehicle to get us from point A to point B. Where that balance is, no one knows, and that time will tell. I think it's quite interesting for automation, particularly because, as we all know, this technology will not necessarily be inexpensive, especially at the beginning. And so if we think about, the idea of a shared fleet of vehicles and all the benefits that come with that in terms of parking and efficiency, we can start to see that the concept of shared use and automation really do fit together nicely. And as you mentioned earlier, with electrification and communication, you can really build out a true automated transportation as a service model at scale in large areas. So I think all those technologies will certainly come together. I don't look at it as kind of, the traditional industry versus the rideshare industry, because in the end, we need to work together to deliver this technology in a way that does scale and does provide the benefits that we're looking for. And so I think it's another reason it's a fascinating time to be in the automotive industry. I mean, not only are the vehicles today so incredibly capable, we have this new technology that we can now develop that will add to their utility for society for the next 50 years.
So we manufacture vehicles today thinking that the longevity of the vehicle is 20 years, 15, 20 years. Now, when you're talking about a fleet, this, like you said, there will be no parking problem. We'll be using the resources. The lifespan of these vehicles will not be 20 years. And the safety mechanism that we put today is for 20 years. We will not need to put it for 20 years. At the same time, it's going to bring other challenges that the vehicle was not designed for. What do you think of that as a manufacturing, the manufacturing industry tradition? Like you said, I mean, in the end, we have to work together. We will still need a vehicle, and the traditional OEMs will have to make one. Irrespective of the AV technology, your company is already dealing with such thing. Your vehicles are in the street. Okay, when it's a human, it's probably not 24/7, but when it's automated, you want to put a vehicle 24/7 in the street. How will that safety challenge be tackled, you think?
We should expect, vehicles. Sorry about that. Vehicles to I'll call it wear out much more quickly. However, that's a huge opportunity also. One of the experiences that I think about from my time at USDOT, we worked regularly to develop and encourage deployment of new technology, but that technology always took 5, 10, 15 years really to penetrate the fleet at any significant number. Now, with automated technology and even ADAS technology, as vehicles are used more regularly throughout the day, they will certainly have a shorter overall life, meaning new vehicles will have to be introduced to replace them, bringing the opportunity to actually deploy advanced safety technology much more quickly, more rapidly as it spreads throughout that fleet of vehicles.
Great point. Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, I think that it remains to be seen what the useful life of a fully automated vehicle that's used as a transportation as a service use case. So it remains to be seen how long that vehicle will actually last. You think about commercial vehicles like trucks. They're designed for hundreds of thousands or even million miles. That's a different paradigm than it is for a traditional passenger vehicle. Will vehicles migrate to that? We don't know yet. I guess my overall point is that that's probably not necessarily a gating factor for deployment of AV. The automotive industry will do what it needs to do to design and deploy those vehicles, as needed. Again, they're highly capable of designing and engineering, producing a product that we all rely on. So it'll be interesting to see what that does to overall vehicle sales. Yeah, maybe fewer individual purchases, but more often, who knows where that really comes out. But I do look at it as an opportunity to deploy safety technology much more quickly.
I love that point that we can deploy the safety technologies much quicker. Like now we have vehicles in the street which are 15, 20 years old, and they do not have the safety feature that we'd like to have them. My question to you, you are responsible for AV safety for Lyft. What is, in your opinion, the biggest safety challenge we have today for AV? Before we deploy the vehicle in the street, what are the problems that we have to solve?
There are definitely still significant challenges. I think the biggest one is less of a technical challenge. It's more of a societal one, which is, we need to earn the trust of users. And I say users of the vehicle, as well as other road users that may not be in the vehicle. We need to earn their trust to deploy these things successfully at scale. And there's a very difficult question. We talk about it. We've been talking about it at automated vehicle safety conferences for the last, I'll say, at least 10, 12 years. How safe is safe enough? Or what is safe? And how do we actually show that it's safe? That is still a very interesting challenge. And I do think that there is certainly great progress being made to answer that question. But I think it's less of a technical challenge. It's more of a societal one. How do we actually convince our users and other stakeholders that we're ready to go? How do we convince ourselves? And so I think that's a very difficult current challenge still that we haven't actually consensus on and created a standard around. And that's a really important point, because if you think about the way that we've done automotive safety for that last 30 years, and many other industries for that matter, we do rely on building technical knowledge as we develop a product, but importantly trying to standardize that knowledge in a way that allows us to demonstrate that it is safe. And we create voluntary standards. We create what we would call best practices, voluntary standards, and then eventually in some cases regulation. And that's how we have effectuated safety for the last 50 plus years. We need to do the same. We can rely on that process for automated safety. It's very difficult to create, as it turns out, it's difficult to create meaningful standards for AV safety, but that process still works.
I agree with you 100%. It's hard to create a safety standard. How safe is safe, especially in terms of AV. Now, traditionally, when we talk about safety, we talked about failure occurring inside the vehicle. Now we have an environment that we deal with, and theoretically, it's infinite. There is a big unknown. When you know something, you can take measure. When you do not know something, you cannot take measure. ISO's extension of safety standard, the SOTIF standard of safety of the intended functionality, talks about outside of the vehicle, but it goes only to level 2. There's a long way to go. The problem that you meant, how safe is safe, how to convince the people, the society that trust an autonomous vehicle. Here are several issues that I want to ask you what your opinion. One is testing. I live in Unterschleißheim, which is the north of Munich. where we have the BMW autonomous campus, and we see the BMW AVs, they're roaming around, they're testing it. It's one thing to test in the nice suburb of Munich, and to really test dark side scenarios, the scenarios that are really, really dangerous. Now, there is a challenge. How do you test it? Do you put the actual people at risk? There are several challenges. Simulation could be an option, but traditionally we've been using game engines to simulate our scenarios in automotive industry. And we know game engines are not simulating the physics as accurate as we want it to be. What do you think is a solution for testing?
Critical aspect of developing an AV, and it's really critical for an AV developer to leverage every testing modality that we can. And really that does include the three basic modalities. We do need to use simulation. There's a critical aspect in that if we tried to physically test these vehicles in every environment, we would be testing literally for decades, if not even 100 years, before we can encounter all those environments. Simulation provides a way to tweak the test a little bit in a meaningful way. When I say tweak, I don't want to imply that it's unimportant, but it's to change that environment or those conditions, and do it in a way that's repeatable and fidelic. So we can get a test result through simulation that we could never get in a reasonable time period physically. However, we can't only rely on simulation for a couple of reasons. One of which you mentioned earlier, we do want to test the vehicle in, I'll call, critical conditions, whether it's higher speeds or lower mu or foggy or et cetera, et cetera. And so we want to do that physically, and we certainly don't want to do that on the public roads. So we do that on closed courses, test tracks. And the third way that we have to test, and that's where it does show, where we see these vehicles being tested on public roads. That's a critical piece also, because a couple reasons. One of which is, if you put 500 engineers in a room for a year and told them come up with every scenario you can think of, we would still never come up with all the scenarios that we encounter in the real world on public roads. That's one reason. But the primary reason is because that is actually where we are going to deploy these. We're not going to deploy. It doesn't help us to deploy them on test tracks. It doesn't help us to deploy them in a game engine. We need to deploy them on actual roads to make them a useful product. And so it would be, I'll call it, unconscionable for us to deploy those without having tested them in the actual environment, in the multitude of conditions that we're going to expect them to operate in safely. So we need a combination of all three of those. And there are probably subsets there. We certainly would envision that we deploy vehicles in certain, we call them ODDs, operational design domains. And that's a way of tailoring our development to the place where we're actually going to use the vehicle and the conditions where we're going to use that vehicle. And that really is a critical aspect, because if we tried to develop them to be deployed everywhere, i.e. a true level 5, again, we would probably be so long in doing that we would never be able to deploy. So we have to start to think about how we're going to deploy them in this targeted area or targeted environment. And so that allows us to begin to test on the physical, actual public roads where we will deploy the vehicle. So that ODD concept is extremely powerful. It's actually enabling the technology. And so when we think about testing, we need to think about all three modes. We need to think about a focused ODD. And interestingly, that ODD focus brings us lots of opportunities. It's really important to think about, well, how will we actually deploy these vehicles? We at Lyft believe that we won't see a big bang all at once deployment, even within a given ODD. We believe that there's going to be a combination of automated vehicles and human-driven vehicles in that same ODD for some time to come. And of course, that's almost a given the fact that not everybody will deploy an AV immediately, but also because we think that the AV deployment will come incrementally within that ODD. And there may be certain conditions where we don't let the AV operate, but we do need a transportation network. So that's why we think, companies like Lyft and others that are TNCs have an inherent advantage to deploy this technology, because we can do it in a way where we deploy at scale with both humans and automation at the same time, in concurrence, in concert, I should say. And it's also quite interesting to think about what that opportunity then provides to gather data. We asked this. The hard question is, how safe is safe enough? We will answer that question with data by generally comparing the AV performance to that of performance of a aggregate human fleet of vehicles driven by human drivers. And so if you think about that opportunity to deploy an AV in the same ODD at the same time as a human driven fleet, that's also an opportunity to gather data to actually prove how safe the vehicle is. And so we think that's a critical piece for going forward.
Absolutely. So you mentioned the incremental development. It's not going to be a big bang. Couldn't agree more that it's not going to be a big bang that all of a sudden we'll have level 5 that does everything. It's definitely going to be incremental. So the question that I want to ask you, that, in my opinion, if we think about AV level 5 in a geo-fenced environment, we are matured enough in terms of safety, in terms of technology, to deploy a level 5 today. I'm talking about an autonomous vehicle lane, probably in the highway, that just lets the AVs go. It's geo-fenced. Why do you think big companies are trying to solve the corner cases? They're putting all their efforts in the corner cases where they can actually monetize today if they go geo-fenced level 5.
Level 5 means it can operate in full AV everywhere. So geofence level 5, I'm not sure if that really works, but
right.
I do think that to add value as a transportation service, the vehicle needs to operate within that ODD at some significant level of performance, and I mean performance in terms of efficacy. Of course, it has to be safe, but it also has to be effective in getting to the places where people need to go or goods need to go. And so I think that companies are focused on level 4 because it allows us to bite off an ODD, if you will, and still have a meaningful completeness of service within that ODD. I think most companies also have a hard time thinking about relying on infrastructure in such a kind of heavy or high level way, because if you think about the way that we deploy infrastructure worldwide, but certainly here in the US, that is actually quite slow. If you think that the automotive industry moves slow, I think the infrastructure industry moves a lot slower. It literally will take, in some cases, 10 to 20 years from the early planning stage to build a new road or a new bridge or a significant piece of infrastructure. And so AV companies believe that if we rely on infrastructure for full, even level 4, we won't deploy for some long period of time. So the idea of a single autonomous vehicle lane is intriguing, but it probably not effective. It doesn't make for a deployment model that we can see really happening. And even in some countries like Singapore or Dubai, who are famous for deploying infrastructure relatively quickly, you don't see companies necessarily basing their business model there because that does not scale necessarily. Having said that, I do think that there are aspects of the infrastructure that are important. And because it does take us 20 years to deploy infrastructure, we need to be thinking about those now. And those things do include, effective the basics: effective signs, effective markings, ideally a relatively smooth and well-kept surface would be very nice for AVs. But also important are infrastructure that through vehicle communication. While we won't necessarily wait for V2I or I to V, we certainly would like to see some supplement of AV capability with connectivity. And we'd like to think, because it does take a fair amount of time scale to deploy that technology or any kind of infrastructure, we'd like for infrastructure providers and cities and states to be thinking about those now.
I love that answer. That's a perfect segue to my next question, actually, because you mentioned several parties. You mentioned the infrastructure providers. Now we have the fleet operators. We have the OEMs. We have the tier ones. In your level, for example, we have the driver, but probably the driver is not driving. The driver is just there. We have scenarios when we talk about level 5, so to say, no drivers. We have passenger driver, passenger non-driver. We have many roles that we can assign. So this landscape is going to look very different from the way we look at the automotive landscape today. Now, with all these things, what do you think, who are primarily responsible for the first thing you mentioned, for gaining public trust? And who do you think would be the actual contributor in the industry, in a sense that we have seen the traditional OEMs still very slow in the AV industry? So that's my question.
I certainly believe that any company that is developing and deploying the technology really is responsible for demonstrating some level of competence, including safety. And I think that that will be often a combination or partnership. We at Lyft really truly believe that partnership and collaboration in deployment of AVs is critical. It's not just a nice thing to talk about. It's actually has to be, there has to be a meaningful collaboration across these various industries for this deployment to be successful. But having said that, certainly the companies that deploy the technology, and that could be the OEMs and the fleet operators, but certainly the developers of the technology are the ones who really are responsible for demonstrating the safety of that vehicle, of that system. There are lots of aspects to that, including how we standardize on this question of how safe is safe enough. But it's really important to think about that when we talk about safety of AVs, it's not just the safety of the people in the AV, it's also the safety of other road users. And, we at Lyft, of course, we're a transportation company. We certainly focus on all modes of transportation, not just a vehicle, but also bicycles and scooters and even pedestrians walking, and how we connect that to transit systems, buses and subways. That is really where we believe we have to think about all of those things, all those different modes of transportation, to optimize a future transportation system that is safe and efficient and doesn't necessarily take up the whole physical space in a city that our current one does. And so, we believe that focusing on safety for AVs includes focus on safety for those other road users. And we have an advantage there because we do deploy bicycles and scooters, and we do encourage the users of our network to take advantage of all those different transportation modes. And so we think about the data that we will need to demonstrate safety of AVs in urban areas. That will include how they operate around those vulnerable road users. And so we think it's quite interesting to imagine how we will use the data from those other vehicles to help demonstrate AV safety.
Love it. So in the end, what I want to ask you is, What is your vision from Lyft point of view or from your personal vision? Where would you like to see AV industry in terms of safety? What are the things that you would like to see before we're fully deployed?
I believe that we will need to consensus on some basic industry standards. And primarily those will be voluntary industry standards at first. Those standards are very important. Really, one of the critical pieces is that we agree on key metrics. If we want to be able to quantify and say, yes, we know that this vehicle is safe, well, first off, what is safe? The baseline is quite an interesting challenge in and of itself. Right now, our current transportation system, most people would say, yeah, it's safe. But in the United States, there are roughly 37,000 people every year that lose their lives with our current system. So let's say, we say that, that's a safe system and that's our baseline. We still need to be able to quantify a future safe level for AVs in relation to today's system. To do that, we will need to agree on what are those key metrics that we will measure just to determine whether something is safe or safe enough. And there's been a lot of interesting discussion on those metrics, and people are beginning to propose certain metrics that might be useful to quantify safety. So I think for us to deploy at scale, we need to have some concept of what are those important metrics and how we will measure safety. Importantly, of course, we will have to gain trust, earn trust, and we will do that by demonstration. So what I mean by that is we will need to prove by actually doing that these vehicles are capable. And you see already companies that are starting to get into that space. And I don't mean a demo like, a couple of hours or, put people in a car. I really mean a meaningful demonstration, even perhaps an early deployment. And we need to gather the experience from those early deployments and be able to quantify, here's the outcome, and here's why we believe this technology is now ready. There are other things, including insurance, including usage rules that might be applied from a city or a state. Those may not necessarily be necessary, but they likely will come along with those early deployments. So I think we need to be working on all of those things. Again, it gets back to that's another reason why collaboration is critical. There's not one company or one even organization that can accomplish all of those things by themselves. And so, we at Lyft have always been focused on collaborating. We have a dual-pronged program where we are developing our own AV in-house. We call it level 5, even though we're focused on level 4 technically. We also have a second program we call Open Platform, where we work together with other AV developers to deploy their technology on our network. And I can say publicly that we've got 2 companies that we have been working with, and that's Aptiv and Waymo in Las Vegas and Arizona, respectively. We think that model is really important because not any one company will be able to deploy enough vehicles for all of our TNC needs, even for Lyft itself. So we're always looking for collaboration opportunities with other developers, with other companies who want to deploy and may not necessarily want to develop or be able to develop their own network. So that collaboration piece really is critical, and we think that Lyft is in a great position to collaborate across the industry. We have a history of collaborating with the cities that we have deployed in the past for both our vehicle, our rideshare, as well as our bikes and scooters. We intend to continue that for deployment of AVs.
I love the idea of collaboration, and I totally agree that this is a problem that cannot be solved by a single company or a single country even. This is a problem that we have to solve in a collaborative way. There's no question about it. You also mentioned, we have to gain trust, public trust. And trust and expectation is another thing. What are people expecting out of AV? So I'll give you an analogy where the focus in terms of safety. In Germany, we lose about 3,500 lives every year because of road fatality. In 2017, if I'm not mistaken, there was an aircraft crash and about 200 people died. And that got enormous media attention. So in terms of safety, if you do the maths, one of the safest places to be in an aircraft, but when something happens there, we get enormous media attention. On the other hand, 3,500 people dying, how many of them was even covered in the media? And I can see something similar happening AV versus human-driven vehicle. There's way too many fatalities when we're driving versus the AV fatalities, but the focus is tremendously on the AV fatalities, and hence the expectation of people. Is it unrealistic, or is it like we're not looking at the larger statistic? What do you think of that?
I think you are right that there is, well, one, we've kind of have become numb, if you will, to this idea. In the United States, it's literally 10 times what that it is if it's 3,500 in Germany. We've just taken that as, hey, that's a matter of course. That is acceptable. In fact, I think most people, again, would say we have a safe system now. That safe system, unfortunately, 37,000 people die every year using that system. And we've kind of gotten numb to it because we've not been able to change it. But with automation, we actually now have the opportunity to actually change it. And we also know, of course, that 90+% of those fatal accidents are due to human error. And if we are right in that automation can reduce the effects of human error, we ought to be able to reduce some of those fatality numbers. But it is quite interesting because, what will the public's expectation be? I think that no one can answer that yet. We have a system now that we use today that we've come to accept. And we always want to do better than that. What is the right comparison? Is it good enough to be just safer by one person or by a couple thousand fatalities a year? No one knows where we will head, where we will end up with those kind of comparison numbers. It's probably not an answer or an approach that we can answer directly before the technology is actually deployed. So I think it's most helpful to focus on those metrics of that we will make comparisons to humans. We will look at the number of crashes. We will look at the number of injuries. We can even look at the number of times that we have a rule of road violation as kind of a precursor to a bad outcome. By that I mean, how often does a vehicle run through a stop sign versus how many times that happens by human drivers. So I don't have an answer for you on what the public's expectation will be. I don't think anybody can foresee that yet. It is interesting to think about, people's willingness to take risk is usually dependent upon the benefit they get from that risky activity. In the case of an AV, certainly people will want to, I believe people will quickly get used to AV operation because they don't have to drive. I myself have a level 2 vehicle that I drive as my everyday vehicle. And I can tell you that it is quite relaxing to drive it compared to a level 0 vehicle. And that's just level 2. I do believe the people, as they experience level 4 AVs, will quickly become accustomed to it, and that level of benefit will influence their thinking on level of risk for those in the vehicle. But again, it's important for us to also think about risk for people who are outside the vehicle, especially those vulnerable road users. So I don't have a formula or a prediction. I don't think anybody really can. I think we are going to, like we did with human-driven vehicles, 100 years ago, we introduced this technology, and there were concerns about its safety, but its utility far outweighed its concerns for safety. In fact, if you think about the transformation that automobiles have brought to our society, no one could have predicted the overall benefit when they were first introduced. I think that's kind of where we are with AVs also. We really can't fully predict the overall benefit. We can start to think about those benefits, and safety being certainly one of them. The other potential benefit to think about is this idea that, right now when we want to go get groceries or go get milk, we think about, well, up until recently we thought about, I'm going to get in my car, I'm going to drive to the grocery store. Recently, that because of COVID and other matters, that's changed to, okay, well, maybe I can order it online, but it still involves a human-driven vehicle bringing something to us. If you think about the other potential benefit of AVs, it could actually reduce the number of human-occupied trips significantly. We can send an AV to deliver your groceries instead of putting human at risk in that vehicle. If you think about that, you think about the idea that, well, our vehicles are designed, 5,000 pounds to move, maybe a couple 100 pounds of humans and 5 pounds of groceries. Well, the vehicle would be very different if it only has to move 5 pounds of groceries and not humans. It doesn't have to have airbags, at least, unless you want to protect your tomatoes, I guess. But so we can think about the implications of AV in that it might change the way that we design and build and operate vehicles. And those are benefits that, would be additive, if you will, to safety, to human safety. So, it's impossible to make that balance right now. I think we will have to deploy the technology to some extent to understand that benefit balance.
So there is this strange phenomena in safety, kind of like a paradoxical phenomena in safety, that the more you are trusting your system, the safer it gets, you will take more risks. For example, when you're driving your level 4 vehicle, you're really getting used to it, yeah? And then there is a chance that you'll fall asleep. I drive a level 2 vehicle too. Time to time, I am looking at my text, WhatsApp messages, and just in case I forgot to turn it on, I have a problem. So a level 4 vehicle runs really well, but if you are falling asleep, the idea of level 4 that, hey, you're still responsible is somehow vanished, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, technically,
yeah, right. Level 4, you're not responsible. You're either or, right? It's level 3.
That is the challenge of shared control or partial automation is, what we've learned certainly from the airline, aerospace industry is that it's the failures happen most often, if you will, in those phases of either control confusion or transition of control. And so that's why many companies are focused on level 4, is because we don't have to rely on the human to take control or be given control.
Some they're skipping level 3, yeah.
Those are certainly difficult technical challenges. However, I do think that what we see with today's level 2 vehicles that are on the road is quite interesting because, there are quite effective ways to keep the driver engaged. And without naming names, there are driver eye monitoring, basically warnings for the driver to take control, lockouts, if you will, when they don't take control. Those are pretty effective. At least that's been my experience with a level 2 vehicle. And some companies have deployed level 2 or near level 2 without those kinds of controls, and I think that those have been perceived as less safe as those that are basically require engagement of some level by the driver. So I would never rule out the level 2 or level 3. In fact, I do think that we will see in some cases a stepwise deployment of automation. But really, the big change comes at level 4. And level 4, if we can do it right, does reduce, even maybe sidestep that question of control changeover or shared control. It's very interesting to think about. For example, we're highly interested in the safety of pedestrians or bicyclists. And so level 4 has a huge opportunity in that, the reason that unfortunately we have 6,500 VRU fatalities in the United States every year, drivers don't intend to hit pedestrians or bicyclists. It's that they don't see them. Well, the level 4 vehicle or the automated vehicle has a potential opportunity in that its perception system doesn't get sleepy, doesn't get distracted, can actually it takes advantage of multi-mode with radar, LiDAR, and camera, multi-mode ability to perceive a pedestrian. And so there's potential for a significant improvement in the number of pedestrian fatalities with level 4 or automated vehicle deployment. However, the challenge is, of course, that humans do a very good job at planning. When we can see a pedestrian, we can interpret small little cues and clues as to what their pedestrian's intent is. Are they intending to step off the curb into the crosswalk in front of the vehicle? That pedestrian intent issue is something that humans are much better at than automation is. So automation's better at seeing them. Humans are better at figuring out what they're going to do or anticipating what they're going to do. So there are opportunities and challenges. And I think that, when we think about this level 4 operation, we can look at those opportunities, and we should look at those opportunities for making sure that we can gain the trust of users.
I love it. So we do have challenges, we do have opportunities, and definitely one thing that we can agree that AV is going to make vehicles safer. There's no question about it. With that, I really want to thank you a lot, John, for joining us. And thank you so much for watching. If you have any question, comment, if you have liked it, please feel free to smash the like button and write comment in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you, John, for being with us.
Thank you. It was a great conversation. I look forward to talking again.
Thank you so much.